So we're ready to start our second session with Scott Johnson and Kyle Harper. Scott is Associate Professor of Classics at the University of Oklahoma, and he's a historian of late antique history and culture, and has published widely on Greek, and now is moving on to Syriac literature of the period. He's published The Life and Miracles of Thecla in 2006, Literary Territories, Cartographical Thinking in Late Antiquity in 2016. Kyle, on the other hand, we're going to hear more about him. Kyle is Professor of Classics and Letters and Chair in the History of Liberty. I had to mention that because I love that post, at the University of Oklahoma, and has published widely on slavery, sex and morality or immorality. We were talking about this last night. And obviously, The Fate of Rome, which is a book that had the most impressive publicity campaign that ever happened in the history of humankind in publishing. And more recently, Plagues Upon the Earth, that came out just last year. Scott and Kyle will talk about the work of John of Ephesus, and their paper is Eyewitness. Is that still the same? John of Ephesus and the Plague of Justinian. So please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, St. Andrews and the Center, the organizers, and our colleagues. It's really an honor to be here and to get to present for the first time some work that's very much in progress with my friend and colleague, Scott Johnson. This is very much a team effort, as you will see. We've never given a tag team PowerPoint together, so we'll see how this goes. But there is a dirty little secret in the study of the Plague of Justinian, which is that the absolutely most important witness to the pandemic is written in a language that very few people who study the plague possess. And so we all use it, and I am guilty, most of all, in translation as best we can. But there's really no substitute for knowing what a text actually says in the original sources. It's the most important source. It's the longest source by a long shot. It is written very close in time to the events. It is a text that is originally written about the plague, which is quite exceptional and in some ways underappreciated. He's an observant eyewitness, very close in time and space to the events. It is always cited. If you read about the Plague of Justinian, you've read John of Ephesus, because he is the author of several of the most memorable, lurid comments about the Plague of Justinian. But it's absolutely not one single study dedicated to this text and what it has to say about the plague. It's discussed in Moroni's contribution to the 2007 volume, and there are important works on John of Ephesus, but this has never been studied in isolation as a plague text. So we're building on a lot of that work in Syriac studies, but trying to look at this text, really, that is fundamental to understanding the plague in really critical terms, to understand its transmission history, its structure, its genre, even what it is, and the language very, very closely. And above all, trying to see the world through John's own eyes. And as I say, this is very much a work in progress, so we're appreciative of your grace, as well as any criticisms or suggestions for what we're missing here.
Right, so I'll give you a little brief précis of John of Ephesus' life and career. I know he may not be familiar to most of you. John of Ephesus, sometimes called John of Asia, born in 507 near Amida, which is modern Diyarbakir in southeastern Turkey. He was placed in a monastery at the age of 3 or 4 after being healed by a local stylite, Mero. He joined the monastery of Marjan Urtaya, where he learned Greek. This is a common theme across Syriac monasteries and schools in the East, that they were often bilingual. Learning Greek for John ended up being crucial to his career later. He suffered persecution by the Chalcedonians, about which he wrote during this time. Now, from the Council of Chalcedon in 451 to the Council of Constantinople in 553, the Neophysites, the non-Chalcedonians, became entrenched in their own ecclesiastical structures, and individuals took it upon themselves to begin ordaining deacons, priests, and bishops. John of Tella is a famous Syriac writer of the period who ordained John a deacon in 529. 532, John was in Antioch. 534, Egypt. 535, Constantinople. Now in 541, he's back in Egypt, and we're going to talk about his trip to Constantinople in a moment. Afterwards, he's sent in 542 by Justinian, this is very famous, to Asia Minor as a missionary, where he converted thousands, it is said, of pagans and built churches on that trip. In 558, he's ordained bishop of Ephesus by a Miaphysite, Jacob Baradeus of Edessa. And in the 560s, he founds a monastery at a place he was previously resident in Constantinople, in Sikai, Galata, just across the Golden Horn. He became, at that point, the de facto Miaphysite sort of head in Constantinople. But after the death of Justinian, he's imprisoned by Justin II, exiled, and eventually dies in 589. So that's a précis, just a quick overview of his life.
And I'll say a few words about his social world, because it's important to understand who he is and how he sees the world, as well as where he is and why he's moving against the backdrop of the plague. I would sum it up by saying that John is in some ways paradoxically both an insider and an outsider. He's an outsider in the sense that he is a mother tongue Syriac speaker who's kind of an expat in the Constantinopolitan world, who belongs to what the imperial authorities view as a dissident religious branch or heresy. And yet at the same time, he's quite an insider. He moves through Miaphysite networks at the very highest levels, and particularly in Constantinople, he's extremely connected. We can piece together quite a lot about his social circle that involves both remnants of the Anastasian regime, so the emperor before Justin, so two emperors before Justinian, who still had, for instance, a nephew who's quite visible and the most likely candidate to take over in the midst of the Nika revolt. John lives in his house for 2 years, that's Probus. He's very close to another woman of patrician status named Caesarea, as well as, of course, in the orbit of the empress herself, Theodora, who was famous for providing protection and patronage to Miaphysites. So he's a person who's connected both to the highest levels of the court, the aristocracy, as well as the bureaucracy, including a number of very high-ranking and well-known chamberlains or court eunuchs. This is me, right?
Yes.
Importantly, there's some elements of this that are speculative, but we've tried our best to reconstruct what we think is his itinerary. In 541, we believe that he was at the monastery, then in exile, but in Mesopotamia, and had come from Mesopotamia to Alexandria. We don't exactly know why. He doesn't tell us why he was in Alexandria. He was presumably visiting Caesarea and her household as it was being broken up, and he certainly visits a monastery that's well known as a Miaphysite sort of resistance stronghold called the Emiton Monastery at the 9th mile marker outside of Alexandria. And the rest is based on his own description, his itinerary as we reconstruct it. I will say parts of this are debatable. This is our interpretation of it. And I've put Pelusium on there. He doesn't say he stops at Pelusium. I just want to say that. But if you're going the way he goes, you would have stopped there. And if you know Procopius' account, you know that he says the plague starts there. John doesn't. So he sets out sometime in 541 from Alexandria. And he says that he goes through Palestine, but it seems very much like he's hugging the coast and gets to Syria. And he says he goes back up to Mesopotamia. So he says at the very height of the plague, he was in Palestine and went to Mesopotamia. Then he says he went from Syria up to the royal city. We don't think that he most likely went completely overland because he meets another Miaphysite named John Paphistopoulos in Rhodes. They traveled in together along the coast of Asia Minor, making stops at Ephesus and Tralles, at which point they break up. And John continues on to Constantinople, where he is by the spring of 542 when the plague breaks out. So it's interesting that he, in a way, his itinerary overlaps different, very early phases of the plague itself.
Okay, so we're not going to be able to go through the whole stemma here of John's writings just because of time. I want to highlight the pieces here that are in blue. We know that John wrote what we're calling Lamentations on the Plague, which is a work independent. We think it is possible he likely incorporated it as part of his ecclesiastical history. The ecclesiastical history survives in full only in part 3. The first 2 parts do not survive. as themselves, but they survive as part of later chronicles. In particular, the Lamentations on the Plague survives as part of the Chronicle of Zuknin, formerly known as the Chronicle of Pseudo-Dionysius of Tel Mahre, 8th century chronicle. And I've given the edition there at the bottom right, published by Chabot in 1927, which is the edition we're going to be using. We're going to focus in the quotes that we're going to show you on the Chronicle of Zuknin, but there are other ways of accessing this text, namely through Michael the Syrian, the 12th century Syriac chronicle, who deals with the Lamentations on the Plague in a different manner. The goal for our overall project is to provide what I would call a critical translation that would include all the pieces of the Lamentations on the Plague that survive. The current translations of the Chronicle of Zuknin, there are two of them. They are by very good Syriac scholars, Witold Witkowski and TTH, and Amir Harak. They are translations of the Chronicle of Zuknin, and they include this piece, the Lamentations on the Plague, but there are key elements in their translation that we think might need to be revised or paralleled with other pieces of the Lamentations on the Plague that are extant elsewhere and could be, I think, better understood.
And just worth saying too, their translations don't always agree.
Oh, no, they don't agree at all on key points. So,
A little frustrating.
And in fact, the nice little movie that we had there is based more, I would say, on our translation of that text than on either of the current translations. So what is this text? I'll give you a few quotes here. From the beginning, he says, now for the beginning of this narrative, he calls it a tashitha, standard word for narrative in Syriac. It can mean history, it can mean hagiography. The word is used for both. Here, obviously, he's just telling a narrative. The blessed prophet Jeremiah was very useful to us. He who was also expert in dolefully composing songs, Kinyatha, of lamentations, Uliatha, over the desolation and ruin of the children of his people. Kinyatha is an important word that we're not going to explore here. It simply means songs, but it does have a connection to the tradition of Hebrew kinot, etymologically, which are lamentations. So there's already the language built in of lamentation. Just following this, he says, in like manner with the present writer, that is a mourner, Mubat Kiana, be dealing with the account, Tashithe, of this dreadful and severe scourge, Shabtha, by which the entire world was smitten in our time. Those afflictions deserve lamentations. Ebla is a key word throughout John's narrative. It means weeping, but here we're translating it as lamentation. More than anything else, and not only that of us, wretched ones, the Daweh, but if possible, the lamentation, again, the Ebla, of heaven and earth should also be made over them. But even they would be unable to lament over them in a measure that would do them justice, for who my brothers will tell about this hideous and bitter scene. The context of the performance or the audience of this text, I think, needs to be taken into account. It hasn't really been thought through as a plague narrative on its own. It could have been a series of sermons delivered. There are some elements of oral delivery, of Kunstprosa in the text that need to be looked into more carefully. And then from the conclusion, at the very end of this lamentation, he says, these accounts, therefore, are for a memory or a commemoration, an udana, of the mourning, or the lamentation, the Ebla, and sorrows, the Akatha, that took place before our eyes. So we started from the beginning for a token. This is a very key word in Syriac thought, rushma, which is their memory. Again, he repeats this word, udana. And in the narrative, uses a different word here, tunaya, of their order of groanings. We described them one after another. So that's from the conclusion what he thinks he has done and achieved in this singular work that exists on its own.
Is this me?
Yeah.
So I'll go through this really quickly, but just to give you a picture, there's a lot of it's actually somewhat difficult to piece back together about what this originally was. It certainly isn't originally conceived as part of a historiography or chronicle. It's written as some kind of series of lamentations, and as we have them, there's 5 of them. He uses the accounts plural, but the 5 that we have are seemingly uneven. I wouldn't feel 100% confident that there were originally even necessarily 5. But as they're preserved, they look like this. As you can see, particularly on the left, there is a major block of material that the line of tradition dependent on the Chronicle of Zutmin has cut out for reasons that we can talk about. But really to think of the text as a whole, remember we're only seeing most of it, but not necessarily quite all of it in the form it survives. And part of it only comes through the tradition that goes through the 12th century Chronicle of Michael the Syrian. So we argued that John's series of lamentations has 3 main themes. One is Old Testament prophecy and lament. He invokes Jeremiah. Jeremiah and Lamentations are one book in the Syriac tradition. And so he's thinking of Jeremiah both as the prophet, but also as the author of the 5 Lamentations in the biblical book of Lamentations. This is a conclusion that I'm coming to very reluctantly because it contradicts things that I've said in print. John doesn't know the book of Apocalypse in the New Testament, which is always a little to one side. In the Eastern tradition, particularly the Syriac tradition, it's not even clear that you would have known the Syriac translation, but we think now, reading very carefully, that his language is through and through Old Testament, the Peshitta version of the Old Testament. John doesn't know Revelation 14 and 19. In particular, the most memorable image that he uses throughout, kind of the controlling metaphor that the plague is the winepress of God's wrath, very clearly comes from Isaiah. There's an amazing closeness.
I had to prove this to
multiple times. Yeah. You had to say that. So he's right. But there's also a remarkable closeness to a very, very important, one of the most important Bibles in the world, this very early complete Syriac Old Testament, Peshitta version of the Old Testament, that is a weird manuscript. It's the basis of the Leiden Peshitta critical text. So this is like one of the most important biblical texts in existence. It comes from the 6th or 7th century. It's actually a very weird Old Testament because it includes 2nd Baruch, 4th Ezra, the only Syriac copy, and it finishes with Josephus' Wars, Book 6. So it reads as a series of destructions of Jerusalem, and we think John maybe quotes all of these texts. I wouldn't even say it's impossible that he's close to a community that knows this version of the Old Testament. Not even impossible that this was a physical codex that would have been close to him. So John thinks of the Old Testament as the story of the destructions of Jerusalem because of God's wrath over humanity's sins. It's just that now what's happening is that kind of intense violence, but on a worldwide scale. He is very concerned with the burial and mourning of the dead, which in 6th century Constantinople is very much an affair of the church. Citizens are entitled to free burial because of Justinian's novels, which are wonderfully translated by Peter. We can reconstruct a lot about the organization of burial that is the responsibility ultimately of the patriarch. So there's huge numbers of grave diggers and undertakers or litter bearers. And John seems to sort of know this world, which is unsurprising for a 6th century ecclesiastical leader. And we also happen to know little bits about the money, the business side of burial, which was very big business for the church. A lot of revenues and tax breaks going to the ecclesiastical hierarchy. And it's very neatly organized how much everybody is supposed to get. The 8 women marching in front of a funeral get paid 1/24 of a solidus. The 3 women falling behind do not get paid, but if you add a woman, she gets paid a 24th of a solidus. So something of this sensibility of somebody who's very familiar with the business side of the death industry accounts for John's obsession with how many solidi people are making during the midst of the plague. So it helps to see, I think, his worldview and his experience of society in the 6th century. John's our most important witness for the very, very earliest phases of the plague. This piece only is preserved in Michael the Syrian, unfortunately, whose account is a little more abbreviated. And he says that it started first among the people inhabiting the interior of the countries of the southeast of India, which for John is this vague world around Ethiopia, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian Ocean, namely of Cushites, Himyarites, and others. It is pretty clear that for John, a little bit unexpectedly, Kush normally means Aksum, so he's thinking of the Ethiopian Aksumite kingdom, as well as the Himyarite kingdom of southern Arabia. And when he says interior, he doesn't mean necessarily inland. In fact, it seems more that he thinks of Kush and Himyar as the inner countries, the interior countries of the world of India. So it's a text that we want to keep working on that needs to be read very, very closely, provides potentially very important clues. And we know from another passage of John that he thinks of India as the world of Arabia and East Africa. And so these are probably the interior countries of this very vague, bigger Indian world.
Right, so going forward, can you put ahead a little bit? So we're trying to trace the plague through John of Ephesus, and he says it moved through Egypt like the curved scythe of the harvester. It seized more land at each turn and advanced without stopping, then to Alexandria, which was exhausted and ruined by the plague. So this is in contrast to Procopius, who says it arose at Pelusium. So
John was out. John knows Greek, but his world is completely church literature. He does not know the Greek secular, historiographical, classical tradition. So for once, somebody says the plague came from down here, and we can't just say it's a Thucydidean trope. If someone can prove that John knew Thucydides, you'd have a really exciting paper.
And that part's only preserved in Michael. Okay. This is me. Okay. So this is sort of tracing what we gave you in that short film, the little movie. He says that Gaza and Ashkelon were struck and the whole of Palestine. When he refers to Palestine, he says he doesn't know anything about the interior of Palestine. So we think this is a signal that he's really staying along the coast.
Also, the Ephesus don't seem completely welcome in Jerusalem.
No, that's a whole other part of this, is the development of churches and ecclesiastical jurisdiction during this period, which may have something to do with, well, will have something to do with what John knows and doesn't know. He mentions, well, we can skip that. Okay. That's fine.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. This is what I'm getting at here. This is the text specifically from the Syriac, and I'll read this. As for us, at the time until now, the plague, which he calls here Maltana, his standard word for plague, though we've already seen a couple of other words. In Palestine, there we were. This is a very, these translations are extremely literal, okay? So don't fault my grammar. And we left from Palestine for Mesopotamia at its peak of severity. Then we returned and went up. These are just two verbs right side by side, hapakin and slekin. And those have been interpreted in the translations totally differently. And we're trying to understand what those two verbs right next to each other mean. When also the chastisement, the mardutha, arrived even to there, and to the rest of the regions of Cilicia and of Mysia and of Syria and of Iconium and of Bithynia and of Asia and Galatia and of Cappadocia. If you think through these provinces, they're not in any order. They're not in the order that one would move through them. It has been interpreted in some of the translations that he actually moved through these provinces. We don't think that that's the case based upon this translation. And those who are also in them, the people. Then from Syria in the earthquake, this is metaphorical language, Zawa and vehemence, Tapikutha, of the plague, again, Malpana, up to the imperial city we traveled, though the verb can mean walked or sailed. He saw desolation. He says there was desolation and mass death in towns and villages all along the way.
But of course, the high point is the scenes of the plague in Constantinople. And in fact, the last three lamentations John devotes to different themes about the plague's ravages in the capital city, where he clearly was. And he says over and over, I saw this with my own eyes. You should lament for me. He says these are the things that I saw. And when he's writing, he's clearly seems to be writing for a Constantinopolitan audience. He refers repeatedly to in this city. So it sounds like he's talking to people in Constantinople. particularly his fourth lamentation is the longest, the most important, the best, and I think in many ways the most revealing. And it actually has some logic to it. There's a social pattern that the plague works its way up the social scale. So he says it first strikes the poor, then the rich and poor alike, and this lamentation climaxes with the plague's arrival in the imperial palace itself. And there's a kind of reverse theme in the disintegration of normal burial customs. So he says the poor at first were actually still buried with dignity. He imagines the enshrouders, the undertakers, and the grave diggers are very, very busy, but the poor are still getting lamented, they're still getting mourned, and they're still getting accompanied to the grave. Then the deaths become too many for the teams that are at work, and so the people are first put into a mass burial pit, and then eventually they're not able to remove the people from the city, so people die and their bodies are left in the street, and then ultimately people die and their bodies are left in their houses. So there's a kind of progressive disintegration of the burial system that's very specific. And I won't go through all of these texts in detail, but these are the key passages. It starts with the poor who are removed, then it works its way to the poor and the rich alike, and then it ultimately works its way up to the palace.
Okay. So this is just a burial pattern. We don't need to go through all of this in detail because we'll be here forever. But I'll just point out a couple of, in this first passage, a couple of key words. Thus they were perishing, and with great earnestness, hapituotha. So he uses this word. I noticed this as we were translating these passages, this root, hapit, again and again for people he thinks are doing the right thing. And it gets back to this kind of moralism of burial. They were cleaned and cleansed and were buried while being enshrouded by everyone, and they were lifted up and carried away. We think that this is, what he thinks of as the right way of ecclesiastical burial. Thereafter, because the undertakers and buriers, these are the key words he uses, probably for those offices that Kyle mentioned earlier, became too few for the bodies. They were cleared out in a huge burial pit, a kabertha, for many. And then they were put on ships or barges. Anyone standing on the seashore saw the litters which were bumping into one another in the sea. They returned them, they would pull them back, take some bodies off and bury them, then send them back out again and pull them back and put some bodies back in the ground. There were too many bodies to be on the ground itself.
And then it completely stops, and there's no one removing the bodies, and the city stank with corpses. And at this point in the narrative, John says, just as there were neither litters nor diggers, corpses piled up in the streets, the emperor appointed a man, his own referendarius, whose name was Theodorus. Theodorus was going around in the city. He noticed a deacon, one of ours, meaning a Ephesus, who also seemed to be very, very earnest about these matters and took this man with him. This is amazing. This is a real person. He's known from documents of the Acts of the Council of Constantinople in 536. It's striking enough, something about this is striking enough that actually both John and Procopius independently mention this detail. That Justinian basically has to appoint one of his two private secretary for petitions to go out and take over this emergency corpse disposal operation. Again, it struck both of our witnesses as sort of the wrong person who had to do this because things had gotten so desperate. And in fact, the officer of Justinian employs a Neaphysite deacon to help him do it. And of course, if you know this text, it's famous for its, well known for its quantitative claims. He says at first 5,000 a day were dying, then 7,000, then 12,000, up to 16,000 a day. He said at the beginning, then we're stationed at the crossroads and the gates and the harbors counting the bodies, but then they became too many to count. He says, if you want to know how many really died, it was 300,000, but not all of them were actually counted. Later, in a separate part of the text, he describes Theodorus building giant pits, and he says 70,000 were put in it. The Syriac here is quite tricky. You want to say?
Well, the Syriac here is, this is a very literal translation and ambiguous because of the agreement of singular and plural. I could go into it if you want to, but he says in Sikai, this is across the Golden Horn, he made very great pits, pethe, literally chasms, which one after another by them had minhun, by them being potentially agency of the people who were burying. 70,000 were placed in it. So this is a singular at the very end. It's unclear whether, to me, from the Syriac itself, whether there were 70,000 placed in each one at a time, hod, or whether it's 70,000 over the whole of the pits. If it's over the whole of the pits, which would agree with the singular at the end of the sentence, then that makes his number accurate. That means he's actually counting 300,000.
There's kind of a logic.
It becomes more logical there.
But it doesn't have to be the case. It's interesting that he perceives death in the number of dead per day. This is common in classical texts, but John doesn't know those texts. It raises the question of where is he getting it? Are these ecclesiastical officials or imperial officials who might be keeping count of the dead? Not the first to suggest this, but we can make very interesting comparisons with late medieval Cairo, where we have similar kinds of estimates, as well as early modern Istanbul. And if you compare those to what John says, the Black Death examples are not at all wildly out of line with what's plausible. But things like that. So he does say that Theodorus starts taking the bodies on these ships across to Sikai, which is a region of Constantinople that John knows very, very well. It's where he will live. It's where he'll set up his home base in Constantinople. And he says that he brought many people and gave them much gold to encourage them to bury. Procopius, too, says that they went to Sikai. John says they put them in pits. Procopius says that they put them in military towers, just a small difference. And for John, I think you really want to understand the way John perceives this, it's not just that they're being thrown in these pits, is that when things reach the absolute nadir, the people have fallen silent. Ancient funerals are loud. John's writing a lamentation. This is part of a mourning performance. And for John, what strikes him, that's I think very interesting and touching, is that the city had become silent. They were just throwing people in pits, and there was no one left even singing burial songs over them. And so in a sense, John's texts, I think, are performing that lamentation that they never had. And of course, the most memorable image, and one that's very important for John, that occurs at the beginning and the end and then throughout, is when he thinks the burial pits remind him of how and with what melodies, with what wailing songs, and with what mournings and lamentations could bewail the one who survived and observed this winepress of destruction, corruption, and wrath, which is always Rugza, which is in the Syriac Old Testament, but not in Syriac Revelation. Those who were treading corpses were standing, and as soon as they laid down a man or a woman, a young man or an infant, they trampled him with their feet to press him down flat, so that a place could be made for the others. The one who was trodden down underneath sank down in putrefaction, sometimes for 5 and up to 10 days, and they reached the lower regions of ruination. As I said, this is based on the winepress of God's wrath in the book of Isaiah, and it's of course written by someone who was perfectly familiar with the annual seasonal rituals of the vintage, both involving trampling on a pressing floor, and here you can see the mechanical press is removed, but and then grapes would have been pressed so that the grape juice flows down into vats where it's collected. John thinks that this is the winepress of God's wrath, and the people are the grapes.
Just to reemphasize that this is all language coming from Isaiah, Jeremiah, 2nd Baruch, 4th Ezra. The language is specifically not the language used in Revelation, as Kyle said. We are running out of time, but let's just...
He's obsessed with how much money people
He's
are making.
obsessed with how much money people are getting from this, and he's obsessed with gold in particular. And to motivate them, Theodorus was giving them a tremendous amount of money, just pouring out the solidi to motivate people to help bury them in these pits across in Sikai. If they wanted to, I'll just read this one. The healthy who were greedy for gold used to collect for themselves, if they wanted to, up to 1 pound of gold and up to 100 solidi, which he calls denarine or dinare, ubiquitously, on certain days, because they used to collect money as much as they pleased if they did not fear God.
So they're doing it the wrong way. So to sum up, this is a text that is central to the witness of the plague of Justinian. It needs, but I think also rewards, very close reading. It is A text that's amazingly original. It's hard to know what exactly to compare it to at the time that it was written. There's something even spontaneous about it. Unlike Procopius, which I don't think this invalidates Procopius at all, but when you read Procopius, you're reading someone who's in conversation with a tradition. John is a little bit trickier. He's in conversation with a tradition, but we think it's best understood as a tradition of reflection of lamentation and God's destruction of Jerusalem. He's very close to events in time, space, and social location. He's very interested and knowledgeable about burial practice, administration, and prices. For John, what's the essence of the plague of Justinian is God's visitation of wrath on earth, but now instead of just one city, he's destroying the whole world. And it's a very up-close emotional response to events. This isn't a work of history, it's not a work of wider observation or reflection. It's rhetorically powerful and emotional because of the kind of text it is and when it was written. So thank you very much. Look forward to any suggestions or comments.